Hello, listeners, and welcome to Higher Level History. I'm Professor Carthel. This podcast is a companion to the American Yawp online textbook, and the idea is simple. Each episode, we step behind the chapter to find the stories worth telling. We're going to slow down on the moments worth slowing down on, follow the people the textbook can only mention in passing, and ask the questions that make history feel less like a subject and more like a story. Let's get into it. Chapter 1 of the American Yawp is titled American Origins. And right away, that title asks you to do something that can be harder than it sounds. It asks you to start American history before the word American existed. Before the colonists, before Columbus, before the ships, before any of that, there were people here. Tens of millions of them. We have a habit in American history courses of treating the pre-contact period as a kind of prologue. A few pages of background before the real story begins. But that framing is a problem, and not just because it's unfair to indigenous peoples. It's a problem because it's historically wrong. The civilizations that existed on this continent before European contact were not primitive or stagnant or waiting to be discovered. They were sophisticated, dynamic, and in some cases, enormous. To understand that, you have to be willing to think differently about what a civilization looks like. Most of us, when we hear that word, civilization, we picture stone buildings, written records, and kings with names that we can actually pronounce. But civilization is a description of how people organize their lives together, how they feed themselves and govern themselves and make meaning and culture. By that standard, North America before 1492 was overflowing with civilization. The chapter covers a massive span of time in geography, from the earliest arrivals on this continent, possibly more than 20,000 years ago, by routes that scholars and indigenous communities are still debating, to the eve of European contact. What was here, in brief, was this: hundreds of distinct peoples speaking hundreds of languages, organized into everything from small nomadic bands to large, permanent, politically complex cities. Trade networks stretched thousands of miles. Agricultural systems fed enormous populations. Art, ceremony, and spiritual life were sophisticated and varied. And all of it was built over thousands of years of adaptation, experimentation, and cultural exchange. This episode is going to focus on a few specific windows into that world. We'll step inside one of the greatest cities of the medieval world, a city sitting right in the heart of what is now the American Midwest, that most people today have never heard of. We'll examine what the scale and the sudden disappearance of that civilization tells us about the peoples who were here long before European contact. And then, in our special segment, we're going to look at one of the strangest documents in the history of human conquest, a piece of paper that the Spanish used to justify everything that followed. It is sometime around 1100 CE. Imagine you're standing on the banks of the Mississippi River, just east of where St. Louis, Missouri stands today. You're looking out over a city. Not a village, not a settlement, a city. Spread out before you are several square miles of carefully organized urban space. There are broad plazas cleared and swept. There are neighborhoods of timber and thatch houses packed close together. There are workshops where artisans shape copper and carve shells and weave textiles. And rising above all of it, dominating the skyline the way a cathedral would dominate a medieval European town, is a massive earthen mound. It is called Monk's Mound, though no monks will ever know it by that name for another 7 centuries. It rises 10 stories above the floodplain. At its base, it is larger than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was built by hand, basket by basket, over the course of generations by tens of thousands of people. At the top of the mound sits the residence of the paramount chief, the most powerful political and spiritual leader of a civilization that archaeologists will one day call Cahokia. On a clear day, you can see for miles in every direction. You can see the farmland that surrounds the city where women cultivate corn, beans, and squash in carefully managed fields. You can see the smaller satellite communities, connected to the central city by roads and waterways. You can see the river itself alive with canoe traffic, carrying trade goods from as far away as the Gulf of Mexico and the Great Lakes. The population of the city at its height is somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 people. That puts it in the same league as London in the year 1100. It is larger than any city that will exist north of Mexico for the next 700 years. You are standing in one of the greatest cities of the medieval world, and almost nobody alive today knows its name. The city you're looking at is called Cahokia, and by 1300 it was gone. Not destroyed in a single catastrophe, not burned or conquered or swallowed by the river. It faded. People drifted away, the plazas emptied. The workshops went quiet, the canoe traffic slowed and then eventually stopped. And the mounds remained, standing over an absence where a city used to be. Historians and archaeologists are still working out exactly why. The leading theories point to a combination of pressures that would have been familiar to any large, complex society pushing against the limits of its environment. Deforestation from decades of construction and fuel consumption. Farmland exhausted by generations of intensive agriculture. A population that had grown faster than the surrounding landscape could sustainably support. And almost certainly, political instability among competing elites whose authority depended on a system that was beginning to crack. When French missionaries arrived in the region in the late 1600s, they found the mounds but had no record of who built them. For a long time, American settlers and scholars filled that silence with invention. Theories circulated that the mounds were the work of a lost race of giants or Vikings or a wandering tribe of Israelites, crazy enough. And the idea that Native Americans had built one of the great cities of the medieval world was, for many at the time, genuinely inconceivable. Today, Cahokia Mounds is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Just outside of Collinsville, Illinois, if you drive past St. Louis on Interstate 55, you can see Monk's Mountain from the highway. Most people do not know what they're looking at, but now you will. Welcome to today's special segment. We're calling this one The Paper Conquest. You've probably heard of the 3 Gs, gold, glory, and God. It's one of those tidy explanations that history teachers reach for when they need to summarize why Spain sent ships west in the late 1400s. And it's not wrong. Those 3 forces, the hunger for wealth, the desire for prestige, and the drive to spread Christianity, they genuinely did shape the Spanish colonial project from the beginning. But tidy explanations have a way of flattening the reality underneath them. So let's look at what religion actually looked like in practice. Not as a motivation, but as a mechanism. Because in 1513, the Spanish crown produced one of the strangest documents in the history of human conquest. It was called the Requirement. And here's what it was. A Spanish jurist named Juan López de Palacios Rubios was tasked by King Ferdinand with solving a problem. The problem was not the conquest itself. The conquest was proceeding. The problem was the paperwork. Spanish soldiers and conquistadors were enslaving and killing indigenous people across the Caribbean and Central America, and voices within the church were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about whether any of this was legal, whether or not it was, in the eyes of God, justified. Rubios' solution was the Requirement. It was a document, less than 1,000 words long, that conquistadors were required to read aloud to any indigenous people they encountered before taking any military action against them. It opened with a brief history of the world from a Christian perspective, established the authority of the Pope, noted that the Pope had granted Spain dominion over the New World, and then issued its demands. Submit to the Spanish crown and accept the Christian faith, or face the consequences. Now, this is what the document required the Spanish to say to the people they confronted.
If you do not comply, with the help of God, we shall forcefully enter into your country and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can. We shall take you and your wives and your children, and shall make slaves of them. And we shall take away your goods, and shall do you all the harm and the damage that we can. And we protest that the deaths and losses which shall accrue from this are your fault.
Your fault. That is the phrase worth sitting with. The document did not just authorize conquest, it absolved Spain of the responsibility for that conquest. Whatever happened next, the killing, the enslavement, the dispossession, was legally and theologically the fault of the people who had just been read a document in a language they did not speak. Because that is exactly how it was used. Conquistadors read the requirement in Spanish to people who had no Spanish. They read it from the decks of ships, out of earshot of anyone on shore. They read it to empty forests before marching in. One account describes a friar hastily reading it aloud 3 times on the edge of a battlefield, far enough back to avoid the arrows before the attack actually began. At its very first recorded use in Colombia in 1513, an eyewitness noted that the indigenous people did not appear to be listening to the theology and that no one present could help them understand it. They used it for decades anyway. Even some Spaniards recognized the absurdity. The missionary, Bartolomé de las Casas, one of the most vocal critics of the conquest, wrote that when he read the requirement for the first time, he did not know whether to laugh or to weep. What the requirement reveals is something more useful to a student of history than any list of dates or battles. It reveals how power justifies itself. The conquest of the Americas was not simply an act of violence. It was an act of violence wrapped in a legal language, theological argument, and bureaucratic procedure. The paper existed not to protect indigenous peoples, but to protect Spain from the moral weight of what it was doing. Gold, glory, and God. The requirement shows you what religion looked like when it was being used as a weapon. Now let's step back and think about what the diversity of these civilizations actually tells us. One of the most important ideas in Chapter 1 is the concept of the Columbian Exchange, which the Yop introduces near the end. The Columbian Exchange refers to the massive transfer of plants, animals, peoples, and diseases between the eastern and western hemispheres following Columbus's voyages. It is one of the most consequential events in human history, but here is what often gets lost when we talk about it. The exchange was not an exchange between equals. And to understand the devastating asymmetry of it, you have to understand what was at stake on the American side. The peoples of the Western Hemisphere had developed in isolation from Eurasia and Africa over thousands of years. They had developed agriculture. They had developed cities. They had developed trade networks, political systems, and artistic cultures. And they had done all of this in an environment that, crucially, lacked the dense concentrations of domesticated animals that characterized the Old World. That last point matters enormously. The great epidemic diseases of human history, like smallpox and measles and typhus and bubonic plague, all developed in the Old World over millennia, largely because of the close proximity between humans and domesticated animals like cattle, pigs, and horses. These diseases were devastating when they first appeared, but over time, Old World populations developed some degree of immune resistance. Native Americans had no such resistance. They had no cattle, no pigs, no horses. They had no prior exposure to this plethora of diseases. When European contact began in the late 1400s and accelerated through the 1500s, the result was one of the most catastrophic demographic collapses in human history. Historians estimate that between 50 and 90% of the indigenous population of the Americas died within a century of sustained European contact. Some groups were virtually wiped out before they ever encountered a European soldier or settler. The diseases traveled faster than the people who actually carried them. This context matters for everything that follows in the course. When we talk about how quickly European colonists established themselves in North America, we are talking about a continent that had been, in many places, catastrophically depopulated within living memory. The wilderness that European settlers described was often not wilderness at all. It was farmland and forests that had been managed for centuries, recently abandoned by communities that no longer existed. Understanding Chapter 1 means understanding that the story of American history does not begin with Europeans. It begins here, with the people who were already present, with the civilizations they built, and with the world that was destroyed when two hemispheres, separated for more than 10,000 years, suddenly collided. When you open Chapter 1 of the American Yacht, you're going to move through a lot of geography and a lot of time. The chapter covers the first migrations into the Americas, the development of agriculture, the rise of civilizations from the Pacific Northwest to Mesoamerica, and even the beginnings of European expansion. It covers thousands of years in relatively few pages. As you read, I want you to hold on to two questions. The first is this: what does the word civilization actually mean? And does the way we use it do justice to what existed in the Americas before 1492? Pay attention to how the yacht describes the different peoples it introduces. What do they have in common? What separates them? And does the textbook's framing change how you think about which societies count as civilized? The second question is harder, and the chapter will only begin to answer it. That question is, what was lost? When the Columbian Exchange brought European diseases to the Western Hemisphere, the consequences were catastrophic on a scale that is genuinely difficult for us to grasp today. As you read, try to sit with the scale of it, not just as a number, but as a human reality. Chapter 1 of the American Yacht is available for free at americanyacht.com. Read it alongside this episode, not instead of it. I'm Professor Carthel, and this has been Higher Level History. That wraps up this episode of Higher Level History with Professor Carthel. Don't forget to check the episode description for full music and sound clip licensing information. If you have any questions or simply want to get in touch, feel free to reach out to me at prof.carthel@higherlevelhistory.com. And if you haven't already, head over to theamericanyacht.com to access your free online copy of the American Yacht textbook. The podcast and the textbook work best together. Higher Level History is an independent educational resource and is not affiliated with any academic institution. Until next time, I'm Professor Carthel.